The vessel was a small one, a coastal craft of the kind that ran the short passage between Parthenope and Puteoli, and Seneca had boarded it, expecting the crossing to be brief, perhaps an hour or two, upon a flat and untroubling sea. The wind, however, turned against him within sight of the harbour, and the master of the ship, judging that a return to port would cost more than a push through the chop, held his course. Within minutes, Seneca was leaning over the rail, his stomach in revolt, his philosophy nowhere to be found. He would write about this afterward in a letter to his friend Lucilius, and the letter survives. It is the 53rd of the collection we now call the Moral Epistles, and it is one of the strangest documents in the Stoic corpus, because in it, a man who had spent decades teaching that the wise person is undisturbed by external things describes himself with a kind of rueful precision, retching into the Bay of Naples. He does not pretend it did not happen. He does not claim he bore it nobly. He tells Lucilius exactly what he felt, and then he tells him what he learned from it, and the two halves of the letter together form a meditation on a principle that sits at the heart of his thought. The principle is this, that there is a difference between the suffering the body must undergo and the suffering the mind chooses to add to it, and that the work of philosophy is not to abolish the first, which cannot be abolished, but to refuse the second, which can. We are going to spend this hour with that letter, and with the man who wrote it, and with the principle it contains. We will not pretend that Seneca was untroubled by his life. He was troubled by a great deal. We will not pretend that seasickness is a trivial figure for the larger sufferings that visit a human being. Seneca did not think it was. He thought it was a small version of a very large thing, and he wrote about the small version because he was honest enough to admit that the small version had defeated him, and because he believed that what defeats us in small things will teach us, if we attend to it, how to meet the large things when they arrive. The principle, then, let us state it as he would have stated it. There are events which befall the body and the circumstances of a person which lie outside the will: a storm at sea, a fever, the death of someone beloved, exile, the slow loss of a faculty. These Seneca calls, with the older Stoics, things indifferent, by which he does not mean that they are unimportant, nor that we should feel nothing in their presence, but only that they do not belong to the category of things which determine whether a life is well lived. A life is well lived, in the Stoic account, when reason governs the soul. A life is badly lived when the soul is governed by what happens to it, rather than by what it does with what happens to it. The wise man, we are told, is the man who has learned to keep this distinction clear, even when the sea is rising and his body is in mutiny against him. Seneca writes, in the letter to Lucilius, which we shall return to, that he could not endure the seasickness any longer, and that he begged the helmsman to put him ashore upon whatever rocks were nearest. He says this plainly. He does not dress it up. And then he writes, and here we slow, because the sentence matters. I, who had always been so eager for liberty, found a refuge even in the rocks. The Latin is plainer still. He had been driven by his stomach to abandon his ship and to swim, fully clothed, through the surf to a hostile shore, because anything was preferable to remaining where he was. And from this small humiliation, he draws a lesson which he then unfolds for his friend, and which we shall unfold here. The lesson is not that he ought to have borne the seasickness better, He never suggests that. The lesson is that the body has its own affairs, which it conducts according to its own laws, and that no amount of philosophy will prevent a stomach from heaving when the sea heaves beneath it. What philosophy can do and what philosophy must do is govern the second movement of the soul, the movement which says, beyond the heaving, this is unbearable, this should not be, I cannot endure this. The first movement, the heave itself, belongs to the body. The second movement, the judgment that the heave is intolerable, belongs to the mind, and it is here, and only here, that the work of the philosopher is done. This is the principle of equanimity before involuntary suffering. It is not the claim that suffering does not occur. It is the claim that suffering is doubled, or tripled, or expanded without limit. When the mind adds to the bare fact of the suffering the further judgment that the suffering ought not to be occurring. Strip the judgment and the suffering remains, but it remains within its proper compass. It does not expand to fill the whole soul. It is what it is, no more. To understand why a man of Seneca's stature would write so frankly about a moment of bodily humiliation, you must understand something of the life he was leading when he wrote it. Lucius Annaeus Seneca was born in Corduba, in the Roman province of Hispania, around the year 4 before the Common Era, the son of a wealthy provincial rhetorician. He came to Rome as a young man, studied philosophy with the Sextians and with the Stoic Attalus, entered public life, and by his middle years had become one of the most accomplished orators and writers of his age. He was also a man of considerable wealth, which he had acquired through inheritance, through loans, and through the favor of emperors, and he understood, with a clarity that he sometimes wished he did not possess, that the favor of emperors was a current which could turn at any moment and carry a man out to sea. In the year 41 of the Common Era, the Emperor Claudius, prompted by his wife Messalina, exiled Seneca to the island of Corsica on a charge of adultery, which was almost certainly fabricated. He remained there for 8 years. He was recalled in 49, when Agrippina, the new wife of Claudius, summoned him to tutor her son, a boy of 11, named Nero. When Claudius died in 54, Nero became emperor, and Seneca, then in his late 50s, found himself the chief advisor to a teenager who would, in time, become one of the most notorious tyrants in the history of the Principate. For the first years of the reign, Seneca governed Rome in all but name, in concert with the Praetorian prefect Burrus. The administration was, by most accounts, competent and even humane. But Nero matured, and Nero turned, and by the early 60s, Seneca had begun to understand that his position was untenable. He attempted to retire. He gave up much of his wealth. He withdrew from court. And it was in these years, the years of his quiet withdrawal, that he composed the moral epistles, the long sequence of letters addressed to his friend Lucilius Jr., in which he set down, in their final and most considered form, the principles by which he had attempted, with imperfect success, to live. The 53rd letter, the letter of the sea voyage, belongs to this period. It is the letter of a man in his 60s who has seen power and lost it, who has been exiled and recalled, who has watched a pupil become a monster, and who has chosen now to spend his remaining days writing about, among other things, what it feels like to be seasick. The choice is not accidental. Seneca was a man who understood scale. He understood but the discipline required to face a small, involuntary suffering with equanimity is the same discipline in miniature that is required to face a large one. He had been preparing all his life for a death which he must by now have suspected was coming. The seasickness was a rehearsal. The voyage in question took place upon the Bay of Naples, where Seneca kept a villa and where he often retreated from Rome. He had embarked, he tells us, from his friend's house at Parthenope, modern Naples, intending the short crossing to Puteoli. The bay is not, in ordinary weather, a difficult body of water. It is enclosed, sheltered by Capri and by the curve of the coast, and the passages between its harbors are measured in hours, not days. But the sea, as Seneca observes, does not consult the maps of men. And on this particular morning, the wind freshened, and the swell rose, and the small ship began to labor, and Seneca, who had thought himself a tolerable sailor, discovered that he was not. Let us read his own words in the old translation of Richard Mott Gummere, which is in the public domain, and which preserves the rhythm of the Latin. You can persuade me into almost anything now, for I was recently persuaded to travel by water. We cast off when the sea was lazily smooth. The sky, to be sure, was heavy with foul clouds, such as usually break into rain or squalls. Still, I thought that the few miles between your beloved Parthenope and Puteoli might be run off in quick time, despite the uncertain and lowering sky. So, in order to get away more quickly, I made straight out to sea for Nessus. He goes on, the wind turned, the ship began to pitch. He tried, he says, to persuade the helmsman to put in at any shore, but the helmsman answered that the coast was rough and that there was no safe landing. And then, Seneca writes, the seasickness took him, and it took him with a violence that no philosophy could meet. No trouble, however, could have persuaded me to endure the misery of seasickness any longer, for the deeper sickness brought on by it was such that I would have welcomed any sort of death. I would have welcomed any sort of death. The phrase is Seneca's, not mine, and we should not soften it. He was, in that moment, a man who had taught for decades that the wise person regards death with composure, and he was a man who, when the sea pitched beneath him, would have accepted death gratefully if it had spared him another hour of nausea. He knew this about himself. He wrote it down. He sent it to a friend. What did he do? He demanded that the helmsman put him ashore at the nearest point of land, which was a rough and stony coast offering no harbor. The helmsman refused. Seneca, who could not bear to remain on board, threw himself into the sea fully clothed in his rough wool cloak and struggled through the surf to the rocks. He arrived, he tells us, more dead than alive, exhausted, bruised, his clothes heavy with seawater, and he lay upon the stones for some time before he could rise and make his way overland to a place of shelter. This is the scene. It is not a heroic scene. It is the scene of an old man humiliated by his own body, and it is told in his own voice. And from this scene he draws, with the patience of a teacher who has had many years to consider what the small humiliations of life can teach, the lesson of the letter. He writes, after recounting his ordeal, that he had been thinking, even as he suffered, about the nature of the suffering itself. He had been observing it. He had been noting which part of it belonged to the body and which part of it belonged to the mind. And he had found, in the act of observation, that the bodily part was bounded. It was bad, but it was bounded. It would end. The ship would reach harbor, or he would reach shore, or the wind would die. What was unbounded was the second movement, the cry within him that said, "This should not be," that said any death would be preferable, that said the suffering was infinite. That cry was not from the body. The body cannot make such a claim. The body can only heave and shiver and sweat. The cry that the heaving is intolerable is a judgment of the soul, and the soul, Seneca says, is the only thing he could have governed, and he had not governed it. "Whenever I wished to escape from my sickness," he writes, "I changed my place, but the sickness pursued me. I tried every remedy, but who can run away from himself?" The question is the hinge of the letter. Who can run away from himself? Not the seasick passenger who carries his sickness in his own body and cannot leave it behind by changing his seat upon the ship. Not the exile who carries his exile within him and cannot leave it behind by changing his island. Not the dying man who cannot leave his death by walking faster. The flight which the body attempts, when it heaves and twists and seeks any escape from its condition, is the flight of a creature trapped within itself, and the only refuge available to such a creature is not a place, but a discipline. The discipline of remaining present to one's condition without doubling it by the judgment that one's condition should not be one's condition. Seneca develops this thought over the course of the letter into a meditation upon philosophy itself. He observes that we tolerate physical illness more readily than we tolerate the diseases of the soul, because the diseases of the soul are harder to see, and because the soul, when it is diseased, often does not know that it is. A man with a fever knows he has a fever. A man whose soul is governed by fear, or by ambition, or by the inability to bear an inconvenience, often does not know that anything is wrong with him at all. He thinks the world is wrong. He thinks his circumstances are wrong. He does not think that the cry within him, the cry that says these circumstances should not be, is itself the disorder. And so Seneca says, in a passage which is among the most quoted of the letter, "Philosophy is no trick to catch the public. It is not devised for show. It is a matter not of words, but of facts. It is not pursued in order that the day may yield some amusement before it is spent, or that our leisure may be relieved of a tedium that irks us. It molds and constructs the soul. It orders our life, guides our conduct, shows us what we should do and what we should leave undone. Philosophy molds and constructs the soul. This is the work. It is not the work of a Sunday afternoon. It is the work of a lifetime, and it is the work which Seneca, lying upon the rocks of the Bay of Naples in his soaked wool cloak, recognized that he had not yet completed. He had been a philosopher for 40 years. He had written treatises upon the brevity of life, upon anger, upon providence, upon the tranquility of the soul, and the sea had defeated him in an afternoon. He does not, however, conclude from this that philosophy is useless. He concludes the opposite. He concludes that philosophy is the only thing that is not useless, because it is the only thing which addresses the only part of his suffering that was his to address. The sea was not his to address. His stomach was not his to address. The judgment within him, the cry that his suffering was unbearable, that any death would be preferable, that the present moment must end at any cost, that judgment was his, and it was the only thing that was his, and it was the thing which philosophy, had he been further along in it, would have governed. There is a passage later in the letter, after the account of the voyage, in which Seneca turns directly to his friend Lucilius and addresses him as a teacher addresses a student. He says, in effect, that the lesson of the seasickness is the lesson of every involuntary suffering. The body will do what the body does. The world will do what the world does. The wind will rise, the fever will come, the beloved will die, the exile will be pronounced. These are not within our power. What is within our power is the judgment we make upon them, and the judgment is everything, because it is the judgment, and not the event, which determines whether we are crushed by what happens to us, or whether we remain within the storm, a soul that has not surrendered its governance. He writes, "It is in no man's power to have whatever he wants, but he has it in his power not to wish for what he hasn't got, and cheerfully make the most of the things that do come his way." To cheerfully make the most of the things that do come his way. The phrase is gentle. It does not promise the abolition of suffering. It promises, more modestly, that within the suffering there is room for a kind of equanimity, a kind of presence to one's condition, which does not deny the condition, but does not add to it either. The seasick man may not be able to abolish his nausea, but he can refuse to add to his nausea the further suffering of believing that his nausea should not be, that the universe has wronged him, that he is uniquely afflicted, that no one has ever borne what he is bearing. This refusal is what Seneca means by equanimity. It is not cheerfulness in the modern sense. It is not the pretense that things are fine when they are not. It is the discipline of distinguishing, within the texture of one's suffering, between the part that is given and the part that is added, and of governing, with such strength as one possesses, the part that is added. What, then, is the principal's structural lesson? Let us state it plainly, as Seneca would have stated it to a student who had come to him in his garden and sat down to listen. The first part of the lesson is that suffering has two components, and that these two components must be distinguished. The first component is the bare fact of the suffering itself, the heave of the stomach, the ache of the body, the loss of the beloved, the arrival of the unwanted news. This component is given. It is not chosen. It cannot be wished away by any act of will. To pretend otherwise is to deceive oneself, and to set oneself up for a deeper bewilderment when the deception fails. The second component is the judgment which the mind makes upon the bare fact. This is the cry that says, "This should not be." This is the cry that says, "I cannot bear this." This is the cry that says, "The world is wrong to have placed this upon me." The second component is not given. It is added. It is the work of the mind. And because it is the work of the mind, it can, in principle, be unworked by the mind. This is the territory of philosophy. The second part of the lesson is that the work of unworking the second component is not accomplished in a moment, and it is not accomplished by reading a book, and it is not accomplished by listening to a lecture, even a good one. It is accomplished, if it is accomplished at all, by long practice, by the repeated turning of the mind toward the distinction, by the patient observation in small sufferings of how the second component arises and how it may be allowed to subside without expanding into the whole of one's experience. The seasickness is the small suffering, the death of a son, the failure of a vocation, the loss of a country, the arrival of one's own death. These are the large sufferings, but the discipline is the same. The discipline is the patient distinguishing, again and again, between the bare fact and the judgment, and the patient governance, again and again, of the judgment. The third part of the lesson is that one will fail at this, often. Seneca failed at it on the boat. He says so. He does not pretend to have succeeded. He pretends nothing. He reports the failure, and he reports what he learned from the failure, and he sends the report to his friend so that the friend may learn from it as well. The Stoic does not claim to be invulnerable. The Stoic claims only that the work is the work, and that the work continues whether one is succeeding at it or failing at it, and that the failures attended to become the material from which the next attempt is made. The fourth part of the lesson, and perhaps the deepest, is that the soul which has done this work, even imperfectly, is the soul which is its own. It is the soul which has not been given over to the sea, to the fever, to the tyrant, to the loss. It remains within itself. It remains capable of judgment, of action, of love, of attention. The sea may toss it. The fever may burn it. The tyrant may threaten it. The loss may strike it. But it is still there, still itself, still able to say what it is and what it is not, still able to do what it can do and to refrain from what it should not do. This is what the Stoics meant by freedom. It is not the freedom to escape one's circumstances. It is the freedom to remain oneself within one's circumstances. Seneca, lying on the rocks of the Bay of Naples, soaked and shaking, had not been free of his seasickness. He had been overcome by his seasickness. But in writing about it afterward, in observing it, in distinguishing within it the given from the added, in sending the account to his friend so that the friend might learn from it, he was doing the work of being himself again. He was reclaiming, after the fact, what he had not been able to maintain during the fact. And this reclamation, this returning to oneself, is the work of philosophy, and it is available to anyone who will undertake it, and it does not require that one have succeeded the last time, only that one continue. Within a few years of writing this letter, Seneca would be commanded by Nero to take his own life. The charge, the involvement in a conspiracy, was probably false, but the order was real, and Seneca obeyed it. He opened his veins. The death was slow, because his body was old, and his blood ran thin. He was placed in a warm bath to hasten the bleeding. He continued throughout to dictate to his secretaries, and his last words, we are told, were a series of philosophical reflections which the secretaries wrote down. He had been preparing for this moment, in one form or another, all his life. The seasickness was a rehearsal. The exile was a rehearsal. Every involuntary suffering he had ever endured was a rehearsal. And when the final involuntary suffering came, he met it as well as a man can meet such a thing, which is to say, imperfectly, but as himself, with his philosophy still in his hand, still distinguishing, still governing what he could govern, still refusing to add to the given the second suffering of the judgment that the given should not be. There is a question I would leave with you, and you may carry it with you as you go. Consider the last involuntary suffering you endured. Not the largest one, perhaps, but a recent one, a small one, the kind of suffering that is closer in scale to a seasick afternoon than to an exile or a death, a bad night, an illness, an unwanted piece of news, a long delay in a place you did not wish to be. Consider how you met it. Consider within the texture of what you felt, what was given and what was added. Consider the cry within you, if there was one, that said, "This should not be," and consider what the cry cost you, beyond what the given suffering itself had already cost. And consider then whether the discipline Seneca was describing, the discipline of distinguishing the given from the added, is a discipline you might begin to practice in the small sufferings, so that when the larger sufferings come, as they will come, you might meet them not unscathed, for no one is unscathed, but as yourself, still able to observe, still able to write the letter afterward, still able, even from the rocks of whatever shore the sea has thrown you upon, to consider what has happened, and to say plainly and without ornament what you have learned. Seneca, we are told, lived 69 years. He wrote a great deal. He failed at much of what he attempted. He was, by his own admission, a man who could not endure an hour of seasickness without begging to be put ashore. And he was also the man who wrote the letter and who sent it to his friend, and who, in writing it, became again the philosopher he had failed on the boat to be. That is the work. It is not a triumph. It is a returning. The wise man, we are told, is not the man who never falls. The wise man is the man who, having fallen, knows the way back. Farewell.
Thank you.